Now, okay, good morning to the current the latest webinar in a series. We have our privilege of having Hunter Allen from Peaks Coaching Group this morning. We have several questions. This is going to be kind of primarily for the online writers. I use Ruby, and there are a lot of questions that come up all the time as to what does this mean? How do we do that? And it seems like a lot of the coaching is specifically for the real, let's call them the trained athletes that are on the real tarmac and riding real road bikes instead of riding bikes or trainers on an online platform. So we're going to quickly discuss FTP tests, training concepts, and how to become a better cyclist, not only online, but on the road as well. So the question regarding FTP tests, we'll start with that. We're going to go through the just so we don't forget anything, we're going to go through the who, what, when, where, why, how, and which.
All right.
So with that, I want to let Hunter give a quick introduction. So Hunter, go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. Hi, everybody. I'm Hunter Allen with Peaks Coaching Group, and many of you know I co-authored Training and Racing with a Power Meter with Dr. Andy Coggin, and just our recent third edition with Dr. Stephen McGregor, and was also one of the co-founders of Training Peaks Software. No longer involved in the software world, but just working on the coaching side. And currently I've written a couple other books, Triathlon with Power with Dr. Chris Myers, and Cutting Edge Cycling with Dr. Stephen Chung. And so working on my new book right now. I can't tell you what it is yet, but I've got a new book coming out in 2024. So I'm really excited about that. And I'll be able to announce that here in the next few months. So look forward to sharing that with everybody. It's been a great, amazing, and a lot of fun to do this, and it's hard, kind of mind-boggling as well. It's 2023 now, and when we launched Cycling Peak Software, which was what Training Peaks was called originally, that it was 2003. So that was 20 years ago that this training with Power Meter revolution really started, from the software side of it. And then 2006 was when Dr. Coggin and I co-authored Training and Racing with the Power Meter, the first edition. So to me, it just blows me away that, wow, here we are 20 years ago, still talking about these concepts, which just says so much to the test of time of how well they are, right? I mean, these concepts obviously work and have worked for millions now of cyclists. And that's really exciting to see and to hear and to talk about. So yeah, sorry, I'm just kind of jabbering on here.
It's okay. Yeah, I'm a Peaks Coaching Group coach as well. And I want to tell everybody, if they ever get a chance to go to a camp, I helped Hunter run a camp several years ago up in the LA area, and it's a tremendous wealth of knowledge. You get to do a lot of writing. In fact, I think when we reconned, there was three of us, me, Hunter, and there was another Cat One guy that was, I forget his name, but we reconned the course. I think we did 350 miles that first week and about 15,000 feet of climbing. But the camps are excellently run. If you ever get a chance to go to a Hunter Allen camp, it's a phenomenal experience. So I just wanted to say that being there firsthand as one of the coaches.
Oh, thanks, Rick.
So I now train primarily indoors. Southern California, there are so many people hit by cars now, and I do work with an attorney in San Diego. I do help him with the property damage reports on the bicycles, and I've seen came in a couple of months ago. There was a Carbon Cannondale Evo high mod system 6 bike, very high expense. It was basically in three pieces. The only thing holding it together was a Di2 cable. So that's the type of stuff that happens out here in California. Too many people texting, too many people driving blind, meaning that they see a parking spot and they'll cut right over the cyclist. Again, most of these happen in San Diego. So there's a lot of now people are starting to ride indoors. I'm doing a lot of bike fitting. I'm seeing a lot of road guys transitioning to mountain bikes now. So that's kind of what I see, at least in Southern California. I've been using a Wahoo Kicker bike and Ruvi for the last several years. If you like climbing, Ruvi is the online application for you. For example, there's a current challenge going on right now, which includes a 15-mile, 5,858-foot Stelvio climb, along with a 13-mile, 5,200-foot Ventoux climb, and a 13.5-mile, 5,500 climb that I finished this morning, the Grossglockner. So they do a lot of climbing on, and I think that's a GCN challenge currently. I do see a couple of the GCN guys on the course. So basically, I believe that the average cyclist can get as good, if not better, fitness and faster training indoors. Why? Well, I think if you look at a group ride outdoors, unless you're in the front of the group, there's a lot of pedaling and then coasting, pedaling and coasting. And when you're doing an 8,000-foot climb, you're constantly pedaling. You're watching your numbers. At least that's what I try to tell people do. Watch your numbers. Don't exceed certain FTP values and or watts per kilogram, and you do fine on the rides. So here's some of the questions that come up from some of the riders. And I think Hunter discussed this one time on one of the Ruvi forums, is that, Hunter, give us a little background on why you're going to get different numbers out of an indoor trainer than a road bike outdoors.
Absolutely. Yeah. So there's a couple things that are happening in indoors versus outdoors. The number one predominant thing that happens indoors is that most of these trainers don't have a big enough flywheel to, once you get that thing up to speed, to take the weight or take the pressure off of the bottom of the pedal stroke and the top of the pedal stroke. When we ride outside, that momentum, that inertia we continue to have, we just don't have resistance around 360 degrees of the circle. We really don't have resistance across the front face of the circle, that downstroke. We have a little bit of resistance across the top of the pedal stroke if you can, basically, get your muscles to fire early enough. But you just don't really have a lot of resistance on the bottom and then behind, on the upstroke. On trainers, indoors, they have resistance across 360 degrees of the pedal stroke in many, many cases. And so therefore, you're just not used to feeling that resistance on the upstroke and across the bottom of the pedal stroke that you are outside. So it feels very, very different from the start in the beginning of this. And that's something that is really, it's critical to understand. And the couple other reasons why your power may be different is, number one, you're inside, so it's harder you're more isolated. You're locked into a more of a fixed position. Outside, we tend to thrash our bike a little bit more, wobble it back and forth, be able to stand up out of the saddle, put our body weight a little more easier on top of those pedals as our body falls down onto the pedals. So that can raise some of the numbers as well. Heat is a huge factor. The number one thing that I talk about indoors that you have to do and is so critical is you have to stay cool. I mean, you have to absolutely stay cool. You've got to have big fans on you. You've got to be cooler than you think that you need to be. Like when you start riding indoors in an indoor session, you actually should be a little cool and have a long sleeve shirt or even a sweatshirt on to start the first 10 minutes, because then you have enough air blowing on you that it's like, man, I'm a little cool here. Then you take that off after 10 minutes and your body temperature is more regulated. So those things can all contribute to that. And typically the case is that your power indoors is lower than it is outdoors. This could be as 5 to 10 watts, or as much as maybe 30 watts or even 40 watts. It just really depends on the kind of trainer that you have, how trained you are to indoor training. Now, Rick, like yourself, predominantly training indoors all the time, you become trained to the indoor trainer. So at a certain point, then your watts indoors and outdoors are basically equal, because now you understand your muscles are used to feeling that resistance on the upstroke. They're used to not having maybe the same momentum that of the bicycle and the inertia of the cranks. So that's something that happens. And so if you're looking at your indoor power and you're going, well, it's the same as outdoors, well, that's what that means. For the rest of us, it's really like, oh wow, I run my trainer once a week, and even once a week, 52 weeks out of the year, it's really not enough, especially if you're riding 4 or 5 days outdoors, to become accustomed to that indoor power. So it's important to keep that in mind and understand that. Now, why is that important? Is because, well, if your power is different indoors than it is outdoors, then you're going to have a different FTP indoors versus outdoors. And so we need to set training zones differently indoors and outdoors. And I'll go into that here in a minute. But that's the key, is that, gosh, we don't want to train at too high of an intensity indoors if we're setting our training zones from our numbers outdoors. So yeah, hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah, no, thanks. I also think that the where the power is measured from makes a difference too. For example, on a road bike, if road bike can be used on an indoor trainer, but let's consider a road bike for definition, the classic definition, it's outside on the outside tarmac,
Right.
and inside is going to be the trainer system. So outdoors on a real road bike, you are pressing down, the power meter's on the pedal. So you're almost directly connected to where the power is being pulled from, or on the crank arm, which is just one slightly couple inches removed from the pedal. Where I think the trainers, you have to go through a lot of the transmission and stuff. And then by the time the power is measured, you're already pushing this tremendous amount of wattage to get the thing going. And I think that's potentially where some other power leaks are coming from.
For sure. And that's a great point. And like, I'm a big fan of the Ceres H3, H4 products. And, number one, the reason why is because basically they have a power tap hub inside the trainer. And power tap hubs were very, very good and very accurate. And they did a great job at measuring power. And I think the Ceres does a great job with that. But like you said, it's downstream of where you create the power. And so you lose 7 to 10 watts downstream. You could lose even more if you have a dirty chain or a chain that's not lubed. You could lose 20 watts just going through the drivetrain itself. So that can be a factor.
Which is like 10% maybe for some people.
Yeah, exactly. It's crazy.
So anyway, let's transition to FTP tests. So let's do the what. Hunter, what, just because we don't know who's going to be listening to this webinar, hopefully this is across the board and it's going to be a great education for everybody. What is an FTP test, a classic definition?
Absolutely. So let's define FTP first. So FTP is the highest average power you can maintain in a quasi-steady state without fatiguing for approximately about an hour. When you go above your FTP, you fatigue sooner. When you go below your FTP, you can maintain your pace a longer period of time. Now, it's essentially, that's the definition that Dr. Coggin and I defined 20 years ago, or a little bit less than that. Well, I guess we defined that in 2003, but wrote it in 2006. But and that's what that definition is in our book. What does that mean practically? Well, that means practically that it's your best average power that you can maintain. So your highest wattage that you can maintain as an average for about an hour. Okay. It doesn't have to be exactly 60 minutes. It could be 55 minutes. It could be 50 minutes, maybe even 48 minutes, but it's in that range. So about an hour. Now, the problem with that is, what that means is, in order to find your FTP, you need to go do an hour time trial. Okay, so you need to go out there and go as hard as you can for an hour. And that is not easy.
Not e-
I mean, for anybody, there aren't as many now as they used to be, but when I was racing, we did a ton of these, maybe 5 or 6 or even 10 a year, 40-kilometer time trials. And 40-kilometer time trial was the gold standard. It still is kind of the gold standard in cycling. And one of the things that everybody wanted to do was they wanted to be underneath an hour for this, to go around 25 miles an hour for an hour. Then that's about what you need to do an hour 40-kilometer time trial. When you do one, it's hard. You're on the limit, you're pushing yourself, you're suffering, you're at your ventilatory threshold. I mean, you are on the limit and you can't lose focus at all. So that's difficult to do on a regular basis. And so that's something that, you really want to know what your FTP is. You just got to go out there and go do an hour time trial. The problems again here too are, well, do I have a climb that's steady enough that I could do that on? Do I have a road that I can do that on, even 30 minutes back and out and back, that don't have a stop sign or stoplight, or I've got to deal with traffic. So it can be difficult just to find an area to do it. And that's something that's a challenge. So what I came up with was a shortcut. And that's really the way you need to look at this, as a shortcut to the FTP 60-minute effort. It's a 20-minute test. Now, that was more palatable for a lot of people because, well, gosh, we do a lot of 20-minute intervals anyway. It's something that you're normally used to doing, and you can ride at 20 minutes. And it's easier to find a course that you could do for about 20 minutes. Don't need quite as much real estate for that. Now, the key here is that when you do the 20-minute shortcut test, you need to reduce your anaerobic work capacity before the 20-minute test. So what we do is we always warm up. I like to do a 20-minute or so warm up, do some fast pedaling drills, 3 or 4 1-minute fast pedaling drills to get the muscles prepared without taking away from the test. Then do a 5-minute VO2 max, basically all out effort. This 5-minute is meant to be over your threshold power. It's typically, if you even kind of have a clue of what your threshold would be, it would be around 115%. But if you don't, that's okay. You just go for it for 5 minutes, as hard as you can go. Your power should be degrading throughout the test and finish lower at the end than it did at the beginning. Mm-hmm. And you're essentially want to kind of blow up at the end, and be over your threshold and blow up, because you're trying to reduce that freshness. All right. So we want to reduce that part before you do the 20-minute test and create some fatigue. And so that's important, because remember, the 20-minute test is a shortcut to the 60-minute test. And so we need to kind of make sure we don't have too much freshness here in 20 minutes. Otherwise, our numbers will be skewed high in the 20-minute test. So you do the 5-minute test as hard as you can go. You take it easy for 5 minutes. Then you do the 20-minute test. You do your very best effort for that. Whatever that number is, then you take 5% off of that number. So let's say, for example, let's just do an easy one here. 300 watts is your number. You take 5% off of that. That's 15 watts. Your FTP is 285. So that's an approximation, right? A point of triangulation of where your 60-minute FTP would be. Okay. And again, I say 60-minute because it's easy to just talk about, right? But it could be 48, could be 50, 55, 53, whatever that is, somewhere around 60 minutes. So that's critical. And some of that's been lost. And I know I went deep into that for there a little bit, but I know some of that's been lost in a lot of articles over time, over the past 20 years. And then, just go do a 20-minute test. And they forget about, and they say, I took 5% off my 20-minute test, and it's way higher than what I could do for my 60 minutes. And it's like, well, did you do the 5 minute blowout effort in the beginning? And if you didn't reduce that anaerobic work capacity. You didn't reduce that freshness, and you need to do that. So that's a real critical part. Always remember that 5 minute blowout has to be done. If you're going to take the shortcut, you got to do the 5 minute first.
And the other thing, Hunter, that's great. The other thing I noticed on the freshness, that's a key point, is because so many people, the first time they do the FTP test, they're fresh and they go out too hard, and then 10 minutes into it, they've given up. Yeah. Then the next time they do it, they remember that and they go too little. Then they have too much energy at the end. So if you do it that way, it kind of takes 3 times. Right. So you can either do it Hunter's way correctly and do it 1 time, or you can do it wrong and do it 3 times. So it's 1 time isn't even fun. So anyway,
that's right.
You're going to do that 3 times. So Hunter, a question came up: why do an FTP test?
Yeah. So number one, the reason is we need to establish a baseline of fitness. And that's really the key. Like, where are you right now? And one of the best ways to understand your fitness is basically figuring out what can you average, how many watts can you average for about an hour. FTP is the direct determinant of performance velocity. So, if your FTP is higher, if you have an FTP of 150 watts and you improve it to 200 watts, you're going to ride faster. If you have an FTP of 200 watts and you improve it to 220 watts, you're going to ride faster. It is the direct determinant of performance velocity. The higher your FTP, the faster you will ride. And so that's what we equate fitness to, right? The faster we are, the more efficient we are internally, the more economical we are on the bicycle itself. So those things are really critical. Now, of course, there's, you do a sprint for 200 meters, 300 meters, that doesn't have anything to do with your FTP. Okay. Or, if you're doing a ram race that's 2 weeks long or something, then that's a different component to it. But we take it because we need to define where our baseline is. And from there, we can say, okay, what are our training zones? And, we're going to train our VO2 max. That's a percentage of our FTP. Our anaerobic capacity is a percentage of it, our tempo, our endurance pace. And then that helps us to understand, are we training in the right intensities? And then that allows us to train to also pace ourselves for events and for intervals themselves.
Yeah, Hunter, you mentioned RAM. A couple of years ago, the local team, I forget their name, but it was all of the semi-pros in our local area: Phil Tinsman and Chris DeMarkey, and that level guys did I think an 8-man team, and they set some big record of, I think it was like 5 days across the country. And their thought was they used TT bikes, and everyone rode for 20 minits at their FTP, and then they rotated out. That's as fast as they could go. So that's a good indication of why do it.
Yeah. And in that case, FTP made a huge difference, right? Because, like, gosh, if you have a bunch of guys whose FTPs are 380 watts and they're all going as hard as they can for 20 minutes and then hopping off, well, yeah, your average speed is going to be way higher.
Yeah. And that's what they those guys are putting out 425 to 450 watts.
Wow.
For 20 minutes. So yeah, that's why it was 5 days. I think it was in there.
That's impressive.
So, Hunter, who should take an FTP test?
I think anybody who is serious about improvement, number one. If you're serious about improvement, then you need to understand where your FTP is, because that's what's going to set your zones. That's what's going to help direct you for your training. And then 2, it's also going to help you understand, quantitatively, is your training working, right? Am I improving? If my FTP now on December the 5th is 250 watts, and I go through 8 weeks of training and I test again, on February 5th or whatever, then it goes to 270 watts. Hey, I know that my training has been effective. I know my body's taking that. So it's important to understand that, because we don't want to just spin your wheels, so to speak, and not and do a lot of hard training, but do the wrong training and not actually improve from it. So anybody who's really important, who wants to train and improve, is the number one person. And then of course just that, yeah.
Right. And training also includes rest days. It also includes going easy days, and it also includes all out days. So on the indoor training, you see a lot of every ride is all out. So that's the wrong type of training. So that's what we need a coach, and
Right,
then
right,
that can help you. So
right.
when is the best time to take an FTP test? How many times a year should you do that?
Yeah, great question. So I suggest that you take one every 6 to 8 weeks. Okay. So our fitness changes in 6 to 8 week cycles. And so and typically you can think of it right as the typical periodization cycle is 3 weeks on, 1 week off, 3 weeks on, 1 week off. Right. That's 8 weeks. It's 6 weeks of training, it's 8 weeks total time. And so obviously we improve during our rest periods. And in that 8 week cycle, at the end of that 8 week cycle is like a great time to test. It's at the end of your rest week. You're fresh. You can go out, and crack out a really good number that resets your training zones. So the next 8 weeks, you've got the right training zones going into the next 8 week cycle. So to me, every 8 weeks is critical. That's winter, that's summer, that's spring, that's fall, wherever that is, that's important. Now, do you need to train if you're an active racer and doing a lot of really hard FTP work, and you're getting that in races? Then not really. During the racing season, if you're getting a ton of really hard training rides in, you're getting a lot of hard racing rides in, then for sure you're going to get that data just in your training and racing itself. So during that period of time, if you know what you're looking for and you know what's going on, then you can definitely say, well, gosh, you know what? My FTP is here. I don't need to do a test. I just did a test basically in my last race, essentially. So that's the only kind of caveat to that.
So taking one step further, how should you prepare? You mentioned racers that are always at during the racing, they're all on, well, they're on 100% off, on off as they're going through the crits.
Right.
How should you prepare for it? How much training does he average? Let's again go to the online Ruvi or Zwift type person that's just riding the bike, training a little bit, wants to get better shape and get a little stronger. How do they prepare for it? How much pre-training do they need to do? When should they rest before an FTP test, and et cetera? FTP test and fatigue, I'm sure, are contradictory as you go. You can't do a all-out test if you're already fatigued. So
Right.
what are your
Right.
thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, I agree. So thoughts here. You know, so number one, if you're a brand new athlete to the sport, right? If you just took up cycling and you didn't really have an endurance background, um, it probably doesn't make sense to go and do an FTP test as soon as you get started cycling. You need some time in the saddle. You need some time riding your bike. You need to get out there and become proficient just riding and getting in some endurance miles. If you've been riding for a while, then that's okay, right? You can kind of take that test whenever. If you're coming back from not having ridden for a couple of weeks or so, you might want to get a week of training under your belt, and that way your body's back up to speed and in that kind of training rhythm before you take a test. So that really makes a difference. For sure, you want to do this when you're rested. Okay. You don't need to do it at the end of a full rest week where you just don't ride your bike for a week or anything like that. But you need to have some rest so that you have some freshness here so you don't feel that soreness in the legs, right? I mean, you just don't want to feel soreness. You don't want to be tired. You don't want to get on the test and just be like, oh my gosh, I can't even do this. I'm just so fatigued. that really isn't going to result in a great test number. So for sure, let's say, for example, you're going to rest, you're going to take a test on a Saturday, then a day on a Friday where you kind of do some little openers, some nice little hour and a half ride, get the legs opened up. That's great. 2 days before rest day, probably off the bike. Maybe just a very, very easy active recovery day. 3 days before, maybe an endurance ride. 4 days before, maybe another endurance ride. 5 days before, maybe again, kind of an endurance ride or easy ride, that's something in the hour to 2 hour range, giving you that freshness for Saturday. So that's a real critical part of that. If you're fatigued and you go out and you do your test, and one way to understand this is basically, if well, gosh, my last test I did 250 watts, and I know I should be a little fitter than that because I've been training, I feel good, I'm strong, all these things, then, and you go out there in the first 5 minutes, you're barely able to hold 250 watts and you're really, really struggling and the legs are sore, then you're not rested enough to do the test. So that's something that you should be able to assess really in the first 5 minutes of the test. Do I need another rest day? And if so, yeah, just turn around and come back and take a rest day. That's much better than trying to push through and end up with a 220 watts FTP when you know that when you're rested, I could have done 250, then it doesn't really make any difference. You wasted your time.
So Hunter, you mentioned something that we'll bring up here is inactive recovery versus active recovery. What are your thoughts on that?
Great question. So I think that for most of us, and I'm speaking of most of us as masters athletes, riders over 40. Riders over 41, we tend to be more busy. We've got jobs, we've got family, we've got all kinds of things we're trying to juggle. And an active recovery day is somewhat a waste of time, especially if you could bank that. Like if I don't ride on Monday, but I can take that same hour that I would have ridden and ride 2 hours on Tuesday or 2 hours on Wednesday, then that's a much better use of your time. Just don't even ride on Monday, and give yourself that full rest. For those, who are riding at a high volume, let's say, and they're riding a lot, who have the benefit of time and can ride as much as they want. I'm currently coaching a guy who's 53 right now, just a year younger than I am, and he's riding. He has a very good schedule in his life right now. He's riding 20 hours a week as a 53-year-old, which is pretty unusual. And so for him and for riders like that, you don't have to be 20 hours a week. It could be 10, 12, 15, an easy hour of just really easy spinning will help you recover for the next day and make the legs feel good.
Oh, good.
That's your goal, right? Your goal is to let's get rid of some of the waste products from the workouts before, help the legs to kind of recover a little bit, get a little bit of contractile movement here in the muscles. But generally, let's just really ride easy. And you have to ride really easy. I mean, we're talking slow. It needs to be really easy.
Good. This question came up also. Which FTP test? You mentioned the hour, you mentioned the 20-minute. There's also 8 or so other ones. There's I mean, if you can come up with a 30-second FTP test, I'm sure people ask you to do a 10-second FTP test.
Can I just take a pill and you can tell my FTP?
There you go. That's it. So can you contrast some of the other tests that people are talking about, the ramp test, the 8-minute, all these other ones?
Sure, absolutely. So there's a lot of these tests. And so let's talk about the ramp test first. The ramp test is typically when you increase the resistance on your indoor trainer every 2 to 3 minutes in a step, sometimes 1 minute steps as well. what you're looking for in this ramp test, you're looking for what's called this deflection point, where heart rate and power deflect. So heart rate and power are in a linear relationship until they're not. So power goes up to 10 watts, heart rate goes up 5 beats, power goes up 10 watts, heart rate goes up 5 beats until a certain point. And well, gosh, the heart rate's not going to go up any higher. My heart rate's now at 170 beats per minute, and my power goes up another 20 watts. And the heart rate only goes up 2 beats or 1 beat, or it doesn't go up anymore at all. And you're looking for this kind of sustained deflection point. This is originally back in the 80s, Dr. Conconi, an Italian exercise physiologist, came up with this thing called the Conconi test. And that's essentially what this is. It can be used for sure. I'm not a huge fan of it because I think that a lot of the ramp tests are done too quickly. People ramp up on minute increments or 2-minute increments, and then they bump the watts too high. I've seen them bump up 30 watts at a time. I think that's too much. You kind of blow before your body gets in this rhythm and is a sustained aerobic place. And so I think that if you're going to do the ramp test, do it at 3-minute increments, do it at 20 watt increments maximum. 15 watts is even better. It makes the test longer. You go for a longer period of time, and you're less likely to miss that kind of deflection point. I'm a bigger fan of just go and do the effort itself. There's another one called just basically looking at your data, called the critical power. You can just look at your data, called the power duration curve, where you kind of look at it in the Training Peaks WKO software. It'll model your FTP, so you don't even have to do a test at all. That was worrisome for me, because a lot of times it's looking at it, all the time it looks at your last 90 days. You may not have done a lot of hard efforts there in that. There's another test called the critical power test. You do 3 different times that you might do this at. You might do a sprint, you may do a 1 minute, you may do a 6-minute, or you can do a 12-minute test. And it basically draws a curve in this and says, okay, well, gosh, if you're degrading at this rate, we're looking at this rate of degradation. Out here at 20 minutes, you'd be here at this wattage, and at 60 minutes, you should be here at this wattage. That can be good for a lot of people. It can be fine. A lot of people, it won't work. It just really depends on what your fatigue resistance is. If you have enough stamina at 60 minutes, then okay, that's great. But if you don't, then it was not going to work. I mean, for example, I'll give you a real quick example here. In July, you may be able to go out and crack out 300 watts, and your power is just steady the entire hour long. It doesn't ever fail, or you don't ever fatigue, rather, and you just knock out 300 watts for 60 minutes. Maybe you take 2 months off, October, November, you come back in December, and now you crack out, for 60 minutes, you go for the first 20 minutes, you hold 300 watts, but then the last 40 minutes, now you're holding 250 watts, because you just don't have that aerobic ability anymore. You've lost some of that aerobic ability. You lost some of that muscular fatigue resistance. Now you're holding 250 for the rest of it. You add these two together, that's about 265 watts average. Okay, so your FTP would be 265. So if you did a critical power test in December and used that as your test, you might do a sprint, a 1 minute, and a 20. It will show, oh, well, your FTP is still around, 290 watts or so, maybe 300 watts. That's not going to be a great test for you, because you know that your stamina has gone down, your aerobic capacity has gone down. The 8-minute test is another one that's been popular by another coaching group. That's a series of 8-minute efforts, and basically looking at those 8-minute efforts is the key here, and seeing those. They're really short. I worry about that incorporating too much of the anaerobic work capacity in it, for it to be, again, a true test of what that is. And the same situation as the critical power curve or critical power analysis is that it doesn't incorporate what your power is doing towards the end and how your stamina, and it really involves that 1 hour test. So that's kind of, hopefully that helps. There's a lot of these things.
So we're back to the 20-minute.
Exactly.
Great. So I'm gonna give a couple examples here, and then we'll ask Hunter the question. So the question first, in the back of your mind, going to keep, is the hour FTP test specifically for trained athletes or all athletes, including untrained and beginners? So the reason I mention this is because for a while last year, I led a weekly FTP builder on Friday on Ruvi. And when we first started, there were several people that stuck with it through the whole thing. Those that found it too hard and gave up, they didn't get any additional benefit. But they'll tell you what, most of them could not hold 100% FTP for 5 minutes.
Yeah.
And after 6 months of doing this, we were doing 3 sets of 20 minutes at 100% FTP. So nice. it does work, the right training. Also, here's kind of on the other end. A lot of people were asking me, well, I'm not getting these 5% reductions. So what I'm getting at is that I surveyed quite a few riders at different fitness levels, asking them what their 20-minute number was, and then asked them to subtract 5% and then ride that number for an hour. The worst case was a guy did 35 minutes. The next grouping was about 45 minutes. Doing quick calculations, there were 3 categories that they came up with. They told me that for an untrained, non-racer, indoor trainer person, instead of subtracting 5%, there was a group that could do the test if they subtracted 8%. There's another grouping that if they subtracted 10%, and a third grouping, the most untrained, if they did 12%. So this is a great question for Hunter, is that the FTP tests who are they geared for, and what type of training should you be coming to it prior to? How much fitness should you have when you're doing a full hour or even a 20-minute FTP test?
Right. Absolutely. I mean, I think that's something that, is a great question, because, it's very true in that most people who are starting out, they just don't have the aerobic efficiency. They don't have the aerobic capacity to maintain this. And so, I think that's where you as the coach, you have to, make that assessment, like with this person. Gosh, we're a new group of riders, and they just can't do this right now. So it may be one of these things where, like you say, I mean, that's a great coaching call, on your part, Rick, to say, hey, you know what, they're just not ready for this yet.
Ready for you.
And so I think that's something that athletes need to be able to do. Maybe it's 6 months, maybe it's 3 months, maybe it's 1 month. Who knows, depending on their training, their adaptation, what they've done. And the 5% number is just an approximation. It's just an estimation of it. So, I've seen 8, 10, 12% as well. And those numbers fluctuate depending on a couple of things. Number one, are they highly trained? Highly trained are going to be closer to the 5% because they're just not going to fatigue as quickly. Two, it's going to depend on how strong is their anaerobic ability. So, I've had athletes that I've coached in the past where their anaerobic ability has been world class, and they can crack out 800 watts for a minute. I mean, just huge numbers, world class numbers for a minute. And so just having that anaerobic ability can skew their 20-minute number, even after doing the 5-minute blowout. And so it's like, gosh, this person is so good at going hard in the beginning of their test, that we need to take 10% off of their number. Um, so I think that's important. People who are just steady state all day long, diesel, drone forever, don't have a sprint, don't have any anaerobic ability, they're going to be much closer to 5%, could be even 3%, maybe even 2%. So I think that's where you as the coach, you have to assess, the fitness of the rider, understand a bit about their physiology. And you may not know if you get a new rider that you start coaching and start working with, well, gosh, what is their anaerobic capacity? I don't know. Never coached them before. I don't have any data on them. So, okay, we're going to work with them for 2 or 3 months to get them going, to get them ready for an FTP test. I'm going to have them do, my power profile test. They got to do a 1-minute effort all out. Then they've got to do a 5-minute, they got to do a 20-minute, and then they've got to do a sprint, right? And so we figure out what their power profile is to determine, oh, wow, they've got an incredible 1 minute. Now I need to probably take more off of that 20-minute than 5%. So that's a great observation. Great. Glad you surveyed folks, and that's perfect coaching. Great job.
Yeah, and that's good to note is that as soon as people start riding, you need some fitness in your legs before you start in your cardiovascular also to keep before you do these tests that will give you meaningful numbers. Right, that's good point.
Yeah.
Another thing came up on training zones. When we do we'll do a zone 2 recovery ride, and there's always an argument. Zone 2, do you mean heart rate or do you mean power? So what's your thoughts on that? Because they're clearly divided on the online online coaching, online training, I should say.
Sure. Well, remember, always heart rate is a response. Okay. So heart rate is a response. It responds to the training dose, right? The training dose is wattage, right? It's just it's like, gosh, if you do 100 watts, my heart rate goes to 110. If I do 150 watts, my heart rate responds and goes to 130, right? If you do a sprint out of the saddle up a hill for 30 seconds, my heart rate goes to 175. If you do an hour-long time trial, my heart rate averages 165, whatever that is. So heart rate's always a response, and so we have the dose is really what we want to know, right? The response is impacted by lots of things. How well did you sleep last night? Did you get enough REM sleep? Did you get enough deep sleep? What's your HRV? What's your heart rate variability? Did you drink alcohol last night? How late did you eat? Like, gosh, if I eat within an hour of going to bed, my heart rate is different the next day than it would be if I didn't do that. Just food, right? How much caffeine did you have that day? So all these things can really impact the heart rate. So to me, we use heart rate as what I call it's the intensity of our intention. Okay, so the heart rate is the intensity of your intention. How hard are you trying? And that's what I use heart rate for. It keeps you honest. It keeps me as the coach, informed. How hard did you do it? Right? If I get a power file from somebody and their power goes up and it goes across 200 watts and it comes down and there's no heart rate there, I don't know if they were going really hard. I don't know if they were going really easy, if that was a recovery ride. I don't know. But if I get a heart rate file and a power file, it goes up to 200 watts, it goes across, their heart goes to 180 and it stays here at the ceiling, I know they were going really hard. Okay. So it's the intensity of their intention. When we do active recovery, when we do endurance rides, to me, again, I'm looking at that, power. I use power meter. My power meter is this governor. It's a ceiling for an active recovery ride. I'm not going to go over 150 watts. And that's what I'm going to try and average underneath 150 watts for the entire ride. Then we may use, in endurance, the same thing. I'm going to be between 160 and 190. and that's going to be my endurance ride. I'll look at what's called normalized power. That's the power you would do if you pedaled smoothly throughout the entire ride. In those scenarios, especially if they live in a relatively hilly area. Now, if you go out for an active recovery ride and it's a very, very hilly area and you're doing 400 watts just to go up and down hills, yeah, you're not getting in an active recovery ride, and you're better off just getting on the trainer for an hour and spinning for an hour. That's more active recovery. So start with power, always use power. That's our training dose. That's the thing it's our gold standard. 200 watts is 200 watts, whether it's raining outside, whether it's 30 degrees outside, whether it's 100 degrees outside, whether you're in the wind, you're going downhill, it's still the same. Okay. Heart rate can be all over the place. Not to mention, we even mentioned dehydration and heat and humidity. At the end of your ride, your heart rate could be 20 beats higher for the same power as it was for the beginning of the ride, because you're now dehydrated or you're overheated or just plain fatigued. So let's focus on power and use heart rate as the intensity of our intention.
Great point. Let's get to the last question. Is we hear a lot on the on YouTube and some of the training platforms. The current internet trend is zone 2 training. So, Hunter, what's your take on zone 2 versus other training zones?
Sure. No, this is great. This is definitely a the in thing, and it's made popular by Dr. Inigo San Milan, and then Dr. Peter Attia. I mean, I love Peter Attia's podcast. I listen to him and I even subscribe to them. And he's a wealth of information. And they are just pounding zone 2, zone 2, zone 2, along with a bunch of other folks too, saying this is the way you should train because this is the way the pros train. But you know what? Unless you're 22 years old and you have 30 hours a week to train, this is not the kind of training that you should be doing. I mean, if you're going to ride in the Tour de France and you're going to do 6-hour back-to-back mountain stages in an upcoming Grand Tour, then yeah, you probably need to be out doing 5, 6, 7, 8, 9-hour rides at zone 2. But who in the world has 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 hours a day to ride their bicycle? I certainly don't. And is that really how you want to spend your day every single day? There's a lot of things in life you can do besides riding your bike. I love riding my bike, don't get me wrong, but I like to do other stuff too. So I think that's where they're leading people down the wrong path. Is it aerobic? Will it improve your aerobic efficiency? Absolutely. Will it improve your health? Absolutely. Especially if you don't do any training at all, right? Just go and do something, right? You're going to improve. Is it going to improve your longevity? Maybe you're going to live longer if you do some cardio exercise. Probably so. Is it need to be in zone 2 all the rest of your life? Is it going to improve? Are you going to live to be 75 versus 78 if you do harder intervals? Hard to say, right? Lots of different variables are involved in that. For the rest of us, right? I mean, we have a very limited time to train. For me, it's an hour and a half to 2.5 hours a day. That's pretty much it. I can squeeze out some other things if I plan my life around it, but that's what I can do. And if I ride at zone 2 for those periods of time, I'm just going to get out of shape. I need to do intervals. You need to do intervals. Master riders need to do intervals. I'm not saying you need to do VO2 max intervals in the middle of winter. But I'm saying, well, gosh, we need to do tempo work. We need to do sweet spot work just below your FTP. We need to do FTP work. We need to do a little bit of VO2 max, a little bit of anaerobic capacity. Heck, I even have my athletes do a sprint workout once a month in the winter. Let's keep the sprint going. So give yourself a variety. Look at the periodization, the typical periodization cycle, of making sure that you do a good amount here in this kind of sweet spot tempo range first to lay the foundation, so your foundation is really strong in fitness. And a lot of times we kind of flip that pyramid on its head and say, gosh, if I work on sweet spot and tempo and FTP, when I only have an hour and a half to ride or an hour to ride every day, then when spring comes, I've got more time in the evenings, the weather's better. Now you can go out and you can do your endurance rides, do 4 or 5 hours on a Wednesday evening,
Yeah.
and get that in, and now you're just fitter. So to me, I think that's where
I think Hunter
already fit, right? We're already fit, strong athletes. Yeah, zone 2 is going to be something that just isn't going to make it's not ever going to improve your FTP. I mean, it just isn't. Your FTP is not going to go up if you go out and do zone 2 rides for 2 hours a day, 3 hours a day, even 4 hours a day. It's probably not going to improve your FTP. So.
It's a good recovery for those that are hammering every day on the indoor stuff. So
that's right.
Well, Hunter, we'll kind of come to the end of the questions. Do you have any other training advice? And maybe we got a couple minutes. We can take maybe a couple questions from the audience. Is that okay?
Yeah, well, let me just address these questions because these are great questions here here in the chat. So let me look at these here. I think I went over the 20-minute test, step and ramp test. I did critical power. That was good. Do you recommend the 5-minute blowout to pre-fatigue prior to the ramp tests? I would only do that if you if you know for certain that you have a high anaerobic capacity. You're very good at anaerobic capacity. In general, the 5-minute ramp test is made to fatigue you as you go. And certainly if you do a 3-minute ramp and then bump it up every 15 watts, it's going to be longer period of time. So you'll get to that fatigue. So that kind of just depends a little bit. Let's see. Did your group ask us online? Did your group all perform the proper protocol, including the 5-minute blowout effort? I guess he's asking that of you, of Rick. When they did the 20-minute, did they do the 5-minute effort to start out with? That's the question for you, Rick.
Yeah, I don't think we addressed that. They just did the 20-minute test. I don't know which one. I'm assuming if it was Ruby, they do have the 20-minute. They do have the 5-minute blowout within the test. So if they did that,
right,
that way it was included.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And I think that's the key here, is to make sure that you include it in Ruby or whatever you're doing, that make sure you've got that in there. No, that's good. So I think I've got all the questions here answered. To me, I think that one, we have to remember to kind of conclude and wrap it all together. One, we have to remember that the exercise physiology principles haven't really changed, right? I mean, it's not like now in 2023, humans' bodies are working differently than they did 100 years ago, right? I mean, our bodies are still the same. We have some improvements in some pharmacotherapy stuff that we can do with drugs, but our pancreas still works the way it did before. Our liver still work the way they did before. Our heart circulatory system is all the same. It's been for a really, really, really long time. So the principles of exercise physiology have not changed. They're still the same, right? Training load is higher than what you're used to. We add that training load on. You get tired, then you have to recover, and then your body adapts and gets stronger from it. Okay, this is the same as it's always been. What's different is we have new tools, right? We have tools to now quantify the training dose. We didn't have that before, right? We have tools to measure your heart rate variability, the time between your heartbeats while you sleep at night. We have, I've got this fancy Garmin watch now that I sleep with, and it tells me my sleep cycles when I wake up in the morning, and how much REM sleep did I get and stuff, by looking at the different sleep and movement patterns and stuff that I had at night. I mean, so we have some amazing tech. I'm wearing a continuous glucose monitor right here on my arm. I'm looking at my glucose throughout the day and at night, and where am I, in how's my glucose affect my energy levels? How does my glucose affect, what kind of levels am I looking at when I'm training and doing intervals? So these kind of tech things are amazing tools that we have to use them as tools, and always remember that, like, gosh, our physiology is still the same. We're just learning more about how that works and our relationship to it. And so I think that's an important take home, is to keep that in mind. In any of these new tech tools, old tech, new tech, whatever.
Yeah. Well, Hunter, I guess that's we appreciate you helping us out and attending the webinar with us and giving us great advice. And I hope this will help those athletes achieve their goals. This is great. We appreciate it, Hunter, for spending the hour with you. And it was fantastic. I think there's a lot of great information that came out. And anything you want to say about Peak's coaching group in the closing?
Sure. Thanks. No, Rick, it's been a pleasure. I mean, I love doing this kind of stuff. This is my passion, as you can tell, and I love helping out and spreading the word. And I hope that all of you will go out and do that. And just remember, every time somebody doesn't do the 5-minute test, you pound that in their head. You got to do the 5-minute test. But Peaks Coaching Group, we've got amazing coaches, of which you're one of them. We have 35 coaches here at Peaks Coaching Group. All of them I've handpicked, I've worked with, mentored, still coach, still work with, and we coach athletes of all levels. So everybody from beginners just learning how to clip into their pedals, all the way up to the guys in the Tour de France, and our core group, right, are our masters. I mean, we love our masters riders, and we love optimizing their time and getting them as fit as they can be. So we've got camps. I've got a camp coming up in Chile. I'm going to Chile in January. I've got another camp in Florida in February, some foundation miles in February in warm Florida. That'll be great. And then my 2 flagship camps here in Virginia in April. I've got a gravel camp at the beginning of April, and then our road camp the middle of April. And this will be our 28th year of doing cycling camps, which again is kind of like, I can't believe that. Been doing this so long, and it's so much fun. So it's great. But yes, check out peakscoachinggroup.com. Thanks, Rick. And so glad that you're a part of Peaks Coaching Group and have been for many years. And thank you for inviting me on this. I'm glad to help out, as you know.
Well, thank you very much. And we'll see you on the next hill.
All right. Awesome. Talk to you soon. Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.